Good morning once again, everyone. Time to turn our attention to food for about 50 minutes or so. First of all, I am not collecting the homework today, nor is there a quiz today. However, I will be collecting the homework definitely next class. So what I'm going to do is, since the homework was out of your book, I'm going to show the answers out of my book. And so that you can check your answers with what you have for the cadence types and also for the graph of the Beethoven piece on page 166. While I have YouTube up, however, I do want to play the Beethoven example. I'll do that first, and then I'll turn this document camera on and go to another input system so we can look at the answers. So if you want to turn to page 166, I'll go ahead and play the Beethoven example, since that should be readily available here, and we'll listen to that first.
Understand what she wanted to go out with me? Yeah. Balls among others today. What you're facing is scary, but you can.
I don't know why it does that. Some days. Okay, let me see if I can start it over, if it'll be a little better. It's weird, it kind of seems like it has to get a few bugs out of it or something. Do any other classes have that? Not with the sound file? No, not with, no? Must be just this room or the way it's set up or the connection with the speakers, I'm not sure. Okay, so anyways, let me turn this on now and we'll take a look at the answers. We can, I guess, do page 166 first, since we're already on that page. So I wanted you to graph the form of this short example, and then I also wanted you, I believe, to analyze the 7 Roman numerals that are given to you there in the first system. So we'll take a look at the 7 Roman numerals. Yeah, so I hope you have 1, followed by 5, 4, 3, 1, 6, 1, 5, 6, 5, and 1. Those are the 7 Roman numerals. And then my graph, I can also write it on the board, but my graph kind of turned out to be something like this. 2 phrases, each of which is 8 measures long. So the first phrase begins in measure 1, and the second phrase begins on the downbeat in measure 9. I labeled my 2 phrases A and A prime, because they're similar but not exact. The first phrase ends with a half cadence in D major, and the last phrase ends with a PAC in D major. Therefore, because the cadence strength is weak to strong, the 2 phrases do form a period. They exist in an antecedent consequent relationship. And the type of period is parallel complete. Parallel complete period. I hope that's what you all have. Something very similar to that. Does anyone have any questions about that? Let me go back 1 page then and show you the cadences that I ended up getting. Okay, so it looks like number 1, you should have an IAC. By the way, I don't know if you saw in the assignment sheet that I you do not have to follow the instructions where it says for IACs provide a modifier. You don't have to do that. That's fine. So IAC is just fine for number 1. Number 2, half cadence. Number 3, deceptive cadence. A 4 was a plagal cadence. 5 was an imperfect authentic cadence. And 6 was an imperfect authentic cadence again. And then finally, number 7 was a half cadence, and number 8 was a perfect authentic cadence. And notice that, I mean, you can do it however you want, but when I analyze cadences, to find out the type of cadence, I have to do some harmonic analysis. I have to analyze the last 2 chords of the phrase or of the example. I have to analyze those in the key given. If I don't know what the last 2 chords are, how on earth am I going to know what type of cadence it is? Well, maybe I could look, I could guess, but I think my answer will be correct most of the time, and I'll be most certain when I analyze, do a little harmonic analysis for the last 2 chords. So, just so you know, although I don't make a big deal about this, when you have an IAC, an imperfect authentic cadence, there are 3 reasons why you can have an imperfect authentic cadence. One reason is that both of the chords are not in root position. They're 5 to 1. And that's what the book there calls inverted in the instructions. If either your 5 or your 1 chord or both are inverted, you have an IAC. The leading tone option is when instead of the 5 to 1, you have 7 diminished 6 to 1. 7 diminished 6 is a weaker dominant than the actual dominant 5, so that automatically makes the cadence imperfect authentic, not perfect. And then finally, how can we have an IAC where both chords are in root position? What has to be true? You get an IAC, an imperfect authentic cadence, even though both chords 5 to 1 are in root. Yeah, Do is not in the highest voice. That's right. 4 to 1. All right, now I know a lot of this is review, but I think it's good review because when we get to the larger aspects of form later this week and into next week, you're going to need that knowledge of the cadences especially and the phrases to find your way through these larger pieces. Does anyone have any questions before I go on? I don't know if, I want to go back to YouTube. I don't know if it's going to be staticky or garbly, the sound, but make sure it comes up first. There we go. But I feel like we should do this because we talked about it in whatever class it was Monday. I want to go to Raisin Bronze, just so you can all see that. I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about because was it in theory or was it in oral skills on Monday we talked about that?
Yes, it was in theory.
I don't remember.
Okay.
Okay. I hope it's not garbled.
I'm starving. What's for breakfast?
Guten Tag!
Johannes, Franz!
I bring you arts enriched Speiseplan, fortified with increased test scores and creative problem-solving skills.
It's good!
And good for you.
Bobby? Susie?
Don't worry, that's just the power of the arts!
Feed your kids the arts. For 10 simple ways to learn how, visit americansforthearts.org.
Okay, so I had to do that. Just so you can say you've officially seen that now. How do I get back to, let's see. Okay. I don't think I need YouTube. All right. Okay, so today, what I'd like to do is I would like to review mostly about periods that contain more than 2 phrases. For instance, we can have 3 phrase periods, we can have 4 phrase periods. And then I'd also like to talk about the difference between a repeated period and a double period. I know it sounds totally enthusiastic. I mean, you're gonna be so entertained. You guys won't know what to do with yourself. But let's start with an example. And again, I like to use sometimes perform because it's so readily available and the computer plays it. I like to use some examples from a different theory text so you don't have this in your current text. But I think these examples are a little better and they're widely accessible, at least to me, so I'm going to use these. Let's take a look at this one. This is your standard two phrases, and we'll start here and then we'll go on to some bigger structures. So let me get rid of that. Let's listen to this first. Let me try it again. Let's see if it plays in a second. You never know what you're going to get. Never know what you're going to get. Okay, let's graph this two-phrase example pretty quickly. By the way, this is the last day of review I'm going to do on form, and then on Friday we're going to go into what's called primary form. Okay, something new, primary form. Okay. So this is supposed to go, although you probably didn't hear it too well, we'll do ya da 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 da. Dun, 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 dun. Ya, dun, 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 dun. So there's the melody for you. And if I call the first phrase A, what would you label the second phrase? Yeah, I would label it A prime. Measure 1, followed by measure 5. And although we don't have the Roman numeral analysis here, what type of cadence do you suspect is in measure 4? By the way, there's a C major here. Yeah, half cadence, right? You see the G in the bass in the left hand of measure 4? So I would say half cadence in C. But, now, again, I don't know how much you heard with that garbled mess, but what kind of cadence do you think is in measure 8? Do you see in the left hand of bar 6, do you see an F sharp? Do you see in the right hand at the end of measure 7 an F sharp? What do you think the F sharp means?
We modulated.
That's right, we modulated to G, you bet. So, can I say that that cadence in bar 8 is in the key of G? Yes, I can. And, let's see. Well, we don't get full harmonies, but everything's in root position, and we do have do on the downbeat of measure 8 in the right hand, the top voice. So I'm going to say that this is a PAC. Weaker cadence, stronger cadence makes this a period. A and A prime makes it parallel. But what is the harmonic term that I need for this? Yeah, thank you, progressive period. Yeah. I just didn't get to this one last class. So I just want to show you a period that modulates. It's just that one example. Okay. Let's go on here. The majority of periods in music do consist of two phrases, I would agree. But a period can contain more than two phrases. In fact, a period can contain 3 phrases, and a period can contain 4 phrases. Which do you think out of those two, a 3-phrase period or a 4-phrase period, which do you think is more rare? The 3-phrase period is definitely more rare. It doesn't happen all that much. In fact, the 3-phrase periods are rare in general. But 3 different phrases can go together as a unit when the cadence pattern is weak, weak, strong. And then this unit is called a 3-phrase period. So you can have periods with this many phrases, and generally the cadence pattern is weak, weak, strong. In other words, generally in any type of period, a 2-phrase period, a 3-phrase period, or a 4-phrase period, the strongest of the cadence of all the cadences is reserved for the end. That's true about every period. Okay? So generally, periods will end with a PAC. They don't have to. I mean, you can have half cadence, IAC, something like that. But generally, you have half cadence, IAC, PAC, or IAC, IAC, PAC, things like that. You could come up with several possibilities. I think the example that I have up here is going to be HC, HC, PAC. But in order for a 3-phrase period to exist, the cadence structure has to be something weaker than the end, something weaker than the last cadence, and finally the strongest cadence at the very end. And generally speaking, the phrases in a 3-phrase period are different so that we have labels like that. Okay. In fact, I think this is a good graph of the example that I'm going to show you. So the example starts in measure 9 there, and then we have 13 there, and then we have 17 there. And this happens to be in the key of B flat. Flat the whole way through. Well, let's see what we get with this example. Let's try something here. I'm going to disconnect, and then I'm going to reconnect and see if that solves any of the issues. Because I don't know about you, but I'm sure you don't care for all that garbled. So far, it's a little better. Any of you voice people, have you ever heard that piece? That's a very famous Mozart piece. It comes from, I think, it doesn't say. Gosh, I want to say that. I can't say for sure. I don't know if it's Don Giovanni or if it's from the American Cathedral. But anyways, this is a good example of a 3-phrase period. What we have is a 4-bar phrase from measures 9 to 12, which is we can label as A. Then after that, we have a middle phrase from measures 13 through 16, which we can label as B, because it's different, the melody. And then finally, we have the last phrase from measures 17 through 20, which the melody is yet still different, so we label that as C. Now, the author in this particular text has labeled the cadences for us. You can see that there's a half cadence in measure 12. There is in measure 16, there is a half cadence as well. And then finally, there is a PAC in measure 20. Okay. This is an aria called Voice Trace Arpeggio. So what we do is we have a 3-phrase period. In terms of harmonic content, this should be pretty easy to describe. Since the period does not change key or modulate, what type of period would you call it? Complete. That's right, complete. And based on these labels here, would you say it's parallel or contrasting? Yeah, I would say it's contrasting. There are several cases, there are examples of 3-phrase periods where, since things don't work necessarily in pairs, it's hard to label it sometimes as whether it's parallel or contrasting. And that's okay, especially for 3-phrase periods, because they're rare. But this one I think is clear that you can label it contrasting. Most 3-phrase periods do have contrasting phrases. And the fact that you can certainly label the harmonic content still as complete or progressive, that's possible. One thing I do want to show you though in comparison to this is, let me see if I can put it over here. What would you call, let's say I have a graph that looks like this. Oh, let's see here. Let's see, I have a graph that looks like this. Now this is where things start to get a little bit murky in terms of formal analysis. I definitely have weak, strong cadence, which leads us to believe that this could be analyzed as a 3-phrase period. However, take a look at the phrase labels. Because they're not all different, do you see how we might be able to say that this is just a regular period A to B with a repeated antecedent phrase, or repeated question phrase. Okay? So I might actually look at a graph like this, and I might say, okay, really we have 2 different phrases, A to B, which makes it a contrasting complete period. Oh, I didn't put any keys in there. Let's just say this is all in the key of G. Contrasting complete period with a repeated antecedent or question phrase. And if you were given a graph like this, and if you labeled this as your final answer for this, it would be correct. I would certainly give you credit for that. Okay. I think it's hard to call something like this a genuine 3-phrase period because, again, the phrases aren't really different from each other. And when phrases aren't that different from each other, you can see one phrase as a repetition of another. It's too easy to do that.
So would that still be the same if the first IAC was an HC instead of
Yeah, that's a good question. Then it gets even a little harder. For instance, if you had something like this, yeah, this I think I could go either way, because now the cadences are different. I know the labels are still the same, but this phrase is getting to be more independent from this phrase. Okay. So I don't think we're going to see anything that would be this splitting of hairs kind of thing, but that's a very good question. What about if we had a graph that looks something like the following? Still 3 phrases, but this one's a little easier to see. And let's say this is all in the key of D minor. Okay. Could you call this a 3-phrase period? This one is pretty black and white. Could you call that a 3-phrase period? Yes or no?
Yes.
no? Because
Yeah, no, you could not call this a 3-phrase period. And the reason is because we don't have weak, strong. We have weak, strong, strong. Okay? So this cannot be a three-phrase period by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. What I can call it is I can look at these two phrases and say, I have a contrasting, complete period with a repeated what phrase. I know this gets you into all the terms, but let's say here's my period. What are the two phrases of a regular period called? The blank and the blank. Antecedent and consequent. So this is a period with a repeated what? Consequent phrase. That's right. With a repeated consequent.
What about if you said response, since it's also the type form response kind of thing?
Can you say that one more time for me?
Like, didn't you say that they were also called like the call and response kind of thing?
Yeah, you can use those terms. Oftentimes I use question and answer, those terms. So you could say this is a period with a repeated answer phrase. The official term, though, is antecedent and consequent. I know there's just a ton of terms. What kind of period would this be? It would be a contrasting complete period. And then I could say with repeated consequent. With a repeated consequent phrase. So it gets a little bit, it gets a little bit involved, but if you're looking at the cadences and you kind of know, what makes a period, what doesn't make a period, and you see relationships, some similarities, and you see contrasting differences, you can come up with a very accurate answer for the form. You can. Okay? All right, now, let's go on to talk about periods that contain four phrases. Do you remember what we called those back in Theory 2? They were called, double periods. Double periods. Okay, so four phrases that go together where the cadence at the end of the fourth phrase, or the last phrase, is stronger than the cadence at the end of the second phrase. This relationship, four phrases where the cadences are like this, between the cadence at the end of the second phrase and the fourth phrase, this structure is called a double period. A double period. Now, we got to be careful with the mean double period. It does not mean there are two periods. It means there's one ginormous period. It's just that the antecedent half of the double period is two phrases long, and the consequent half is two phrases long, rather than your normal one phrase in length. Okay? So we're going to call this the antecedent. We're going to call this the consequent. Sorry about my verbal writing. So what could some possible cadence types be for a double period? Well, very common is something like half cadence here, half cadence here, half cadence here, and then PAC here. That's very common. Now, one of the reasons that I can say that a double period does not contain two regular periods is because, notice this, do these first two phrases, do they form a period in and of themselves? No, they don't. And that's the truth about most double periods, is that the first two phrases will not normally form a regular normal period. But that's okay. They don't have to. They're not supposed to necessarily in a double period. So the antecedent and the consequent halves are each contain two phrases. And the first two phrases generally do not form a regular period. Just like normal periods, though, double periods are called parallel contrasting based on whether a lot of material that begins the two halves is similar. So if I had labels for the phrases like A and B, and then I had A prime and C, what would you call that double period? Would you call it parallel or contrasting? Say again?
Parallel.
Yeah, I would say it's parallel. You know why? Because the first half, the beginning part of each half of the double period is similar. And all you need is the beginning of each half to be similar to get some kind of a parallel relationship going. The ear picks that up and it realizes, oh, I've heard this before, and it automatically connects and makes it parallel. Okay? So it's okay that this phrase is different than this phrase, as long as the beginning of this part, this half of the double period, and the beginning of this half of the double period are similar. That's enough to say that the double period altogether is parallel. And if I were to put some, let's see, do I want some? Yeah, I don't need to. But if I wanted to put some keys in here, let's say we're in A minor the whole way through, except, well, actually, let's change it a little bit. Let's say we go to C major, the relative major. What type or what term would you use to describe the harmonic content of this double period? Progressive, that's right, because it modulates. So here's an example of a parallel progressive double period graph. And then the only other thing, since we don't have a concrete example, is you would have measure numbers to put in here. And that will complete your graph. So you fill out, you graph the music, and then you label the music using all appropriate terms. That's the main thing about form that you need to know at this point. And I do have an example of a four-phrase, it is four phrases, but I do have an example of a double period on the screen here. So let me play this and just cross your fingers, hope that this works. It's also nice that the way they lay out the music is that you have four measures, or each phrase is one line, or one system of music. That makes it a lot easier to understand as well. So let's go ahead and graph this one based on the cadence structure there. Let's get rid of all this stuff. This is in, by the way, even though the key signature is two flats, this comes from the middle of a piece, and this is in the key of F. So I'm going to put the cadence types down in here. I, C, and F, H, C, and F. What are the other ones that we have? I, C, and P, C, and F. Let's get some measure numbers in here. 23, 27, 31, 35. I'm just looking over on the left there. 31 and 35. All right, let's do our own now analysis of the phrases in terms of labels for lowercase letters. The first phrase of this big structure is going to be small a. What would you call the second one? Should we give that to you too? What would you call the second phrase? B. That's right. What would you call the third phrase? What is it showing here? And the fourth phrase you would call B prime. It's actually showing next to there. Now, we got four phrases that go together. Do we have what's called a double period? The answer is yes. Why do we have, how do I know for sure we have a double period? Solely because of this cadential comparison right there. If this was a PAC, this whole thing would not be a double period. It would not. But because the cadence at the end of phrase 2 is weaker than the cadence at the end of the final phrase, phrase 4, that we do not, or excuse me, we do have a double period. We do have a double period. All right, so let's go ahead and describe this type of double period using all appropriate terms. Would you say this double period is parallel or contrasting, first of all? Parallel, that's right. And since it stays in F major the whole way, you would call it a complete double period. I'm not for certain, although I'm 90+% sure that we had a test on periods and stuff back in period 2, and I think this exact passage was on that test. I mean, I know it's been a long time now, but you remember that? Do you remember how you all did? I don't even remember how you. Oh, you did good, all right. Oh, you remember you did totally on that. Well, I'm hoping that the fact that we're coming around on it a second time, I'm hoping you can see it's really not that, it's not rocket science or nuclear physics. It's just a matter of understanding what you're looking at. Let's listen to the whole thing again now so you can hear the relationship. If you want to rather follow the graph instead of the music, go ahead. Right here in the graph now. No, here in the graph. In fact, I still remember one of my professors when I was learning for him, we do all this work and then he wouldn't show us the music at all, he just played the music again and you had to follow along by looking at the graph to see where you were. So I thought that was kind of very instructive and informative in a different way in that sense. Okay, so the final thing I need to talk about now is how do you distinguish between a four-phrase, what we call a double period, and something that we call just a regular period that's repeated? Okay. How do you distinguish among those things? Well, let's take a look at an example that would hopefully make it clear the difference between them. All right, let's say I have this, and I have this, and I have this, and I have this, and this is my cadence structure. I'll just put some Mach measure numbers on here as well. That's about as good as we can get. All right, let's say you end up graphing a piece, and this is what your graph ends up looking like. Are you going to say, oh, look, I count 4 phrases, that means it's automatically a double period? No. What tips you off, what gives it away that this graph is not of a double period? Yeah. The fact that this is here and this is here. It's how. Did you hear that? It wasn't just me, right? Just in time for Halloween.
Just misses the wrong thing. Misses the wrong one.
But whenever you have a whenever you have a PAC somewhere, it's like a period or an exclamation point. The rest of this form, it doesn't connect or flow to the beginning half. It's like you have a hard stop right here, and something else begins. That's what a PAC does to form. Okay? So really what we need to do is we need to look at these phrases in 2 units. We need to look at this as a unit, and we need to look at these 2 phrases as a separate unit. Okay? Help me graph the first 2, help me describe or label the first 2 phrases. Are the first 2 phrases, in this case, a period in their own right? Yes, they are. Okay? So I can say that they're a period, and what kind of period would you call that? What is over there?
Is it Josh's office right about?
Is it what?
Is it Josh's office right about us?
Is it?
I thought it was James.
No, we might be over more. No, we're not.
No, I just, as long as
It's
the ceiling's
the
up.
office in the corner, isn't it?
Maybe they're moving furniture.
Or maybe, yeah, maybe, like a janitor card or something.
I just don't want the ceiling to cave in.
Is Miss Aurora doing what?
Okay, the first two phrases form a contrasting, and they're all in the same key, a contrasting complete period. Now, what do these two phrases, do they form a period in their own right? Okay, what type? Contrasting complete period, okay. Do you see the similarity between these two phrases and these two phrases? So what I would say for this whole chart, I would say we have one contrasting complete period, and it's repeated. Now I know this isn't exact because we have the prime. Who cares? It's close enough. Let's say it's modified or close to it. It's just a very repetition though. But the way I would describe this graph, I would not call it a double period. I would say I have one contrasting complete period which is repeated. And that's based on this cadence right there and this cadence right there. Okay? Okay, now, just to get you a little bit started, I do want to show you what you've got to do for Friday it's in your, all out of the textbook. It should be right around page 167 and 168. Flip this switch. Now, in order for you to listen to these two examples that I'm giving you for homework, what I would do is I would just go to YouTube and listen to them there. This is from Mozart Piano Sonata, page 284. It's movement 2. You see the Roman numeral 2? Well, it's probably hard to see. But it's the second movement. Right there. So just type that into YouTube, K284, movement 2, and you'll get something, and you'll be able to listen to it. Now, notice that the author gives you a little bit of assistance. What do you think these Roman numerals are at the end of each of the lines of music? Okay, they're the Roman numerals to help you analyze the cadence on your own. So if you have something that goes from 1 to 565, and the 565 is the last chord of the whole phrase, what type of cadence would you say that this is? Which one? Careful. It's not 565.
Sorry, half key.
Yeah, half cadence, because it ends on a 5, right? And this one goes 164 to 5. What kind of cadence would that be? Half cadence, and there's another 1 to 565, another half cadence. And then here's 5-7 to 1. You can double check it in the key of A major. You can verify that cadence type for you. So what I want you to do is I want you to graph this whole piece using the measure numbers, the labels, the cadences, the keys, and then give it a label, give it a name. Is it a double period or is it not? Is it a repeated period? That kind of thing. Then last but not least, on page 169, this is a Chopin piece. This one goes a little bit faster. Go ahead and YouTube this one as well as Chopin Mazurka Opus 33 number 2. And it starts right at the beginning, so on YouTube you'll be able to listen to it. And then notice that the author gives you Roman numerals or chord analysis symbols at the important points in this passage. So that'll tell you how many phrases there are, and you can identify the cadences pretty readily. Then go ahead and graph this one and give it a label and descriptive terms as well. These are the two things I want you to do. Listen to these and graph these for, what is today, Wednesday, so graph it for Friday. And I asked you to do it on a separate piece of paper. Put your graphs on a separate piece of paper, and I will be collecting this homework on Friday. Make sense? Okay. Then I'm going to stop now because this rumbling and the sound that comes out of this machine is garbled.